So Ragnar, thanks for taking the time to join me on this podcast. I came across you on Twitter as we all Twitter is this big orgy of coming across different people in the space, and so I came across you a while back, and guns is one of those topics that is inexorably linked to Bitcoin, but it's not without controversy, let's say. And I actually, in the rapid fire portion of this podcast, at the end, I do a word association, and I'll do it with you. And one of the words that I've included in that is guns, and because I want to get people's kind of reflexive reaction to that word. And just before I get you to break into kind of what you're doing, it is interesting that everyone I've asked a question to so far has said, something like important or security or what have you. So it's a bit of a disparity from the mainstream view, but I know there are still people within the community that are unsure of or have differing opinions on guns. So I do want to break into that as we go along. But first, maybe you can just start with one, how and when you got into Bitcoin, and two, how, when, and why you got started with guns and Bitcoin.
Sure. I got started in Bitcoin in 2011 when I read about it on the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And so it was an interest in philosophy at that time. And then also I had a small construction and renovation business, and I accepted PayPal. And one day PayPal closed my account, didn't say why, told me I need a subpoena to find out. And I was kind of cut off from being able to pay my guys.
Wow.
and get paid. So kind of the philosophy and the real world experience pushed me into Bitcoin, I guess. And in
Did
terms
you
of
ever find out why they cut you off?
no, I would need some sort of legal action to find out. And I talked to an attorney, and he just said, well, you could pay me a lot of money, you'll find out, and you still won't get back on PayPal.
Wow.
So, yeah. Guns and Bitcoin. I co-founded Guns and Bitcoin last year, and we do a couple of things. We have a podcast, and we have gear relating to protecting your Bitcoin and protecting your guns, and kind of vice versa.
And so the what was kind of the genesis of that? I've heard you on other podcasts, and you grew up around guns, shooting with your father and stuff like that. But what was the motivation behind starting Guns and Bitcoin?
Starting Guns and Bitcoin came from a few things. First, it was, I guess, in a way by accident. I was trying to make a case to hold my hardware wallets. So before, I would keep them in my sock drawer and at my desk and in a backpack, and I just figured out that wasn't very smart. So I took one of my existing gun cases and tried to cut out some of the foam to place my hardware wallets in there, but it didn't work. And then I kind of looked around, didn't see anything on the market. So I kind of made one myself, but I didn't really like it, and started looking into a custom case. And then as I, developed that, I realized, well, there's probably more guys like me out there who want to protect their hardware wallets, who are into guns, or at least would appreciate, the product. So I just went ahead and made it, and then turned it into Guns and Bitcoin from there. But in terms of like the idea, like the general philosophy, it started more like in 2017. That was during the summer of SegWit and segregated witness activation. And it started when someone posted a picture of, I think it was someone posted a picture of one of their semi-automatic rifles with their hardware wallet. And I had done something similar, and I just started to kind of collect these, and more people started to post these pictures of their guns with their hardware wallets. And I turned it into a Twitter moment. And again, this is back in 2017. So that's as far back as I was thinking along those lines. And then when I created this case, then I guess it all came together, kind of the products and the idea.
Right. And has there been, good uptake from the community, people appreciating a product where they can basically, have their financial sovereignty and their physical sovereignty in the same place, and obviously the physical protecting the financial? And has there been good responses?
There's been the response that I expected, which is there's the people who get it and really appreciate it. They're super enthusiastic. And then there's these other people that don't understand it at all. They think it's stupid. They're just not gun people, so they don't understand it. So exactly as I expected.
Right. All right. Well, let's break into that then, because this, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a while, and you're probably one of the best to have it with, given the project and business that you're currently working on. But there's so much contentious rhetoric around the gun issue these days. Whether it's on Twitter, it's being played out in the Democratic presidential candidate race at the moment. And so maybe before I give you kind of my story and take, what's your opinion on the role guns play in society, and your take on the kind of social dialogue on the subject these days?
Um, for me, the first human right is the right to defend your life and the right to defend your family and your property. So to me, gun ownership and usage is a human right. I think it's more important than the right to free speech. I think the Second Amendment should have been the very first amendment, because if you're dead, you can't exercise free speech and you can't vote and you can't get health care or do anything else. So to me, guns is a tool of the first human right that exists.
Yeah, it's interesting. What do you make of I think it was Beto O'Rourke. I saw a funny video of him on Twitter the other day, and when he was running for, I guess, the Senate in Texas, or whatever position he held in Texas, he was, in response to a question, he was saying, "No, of course I'm not going to take away your guns. Guns are very important, blah blah blah." And then, a few days ago in the Democratic presidential race, he's saying, "Yes, we're going to confiscate or take your AR-15s and your guns and stuff like that." I mean, when you hear that kind of stuff, as someone who's grown up around them and who feels so strongly about the role they play in one's life and with regards to freedom, how do you feel about those kinds of statements?
Well, at first I laugh because Beto is such a joke. And I even tweeted to him that he couldn't even take a parking spot for my mom. So he's he's definitely not going to be taking any of my guns anytime soon. So that's my first response: is this is a joke? These politicians are idiots. But on the other hand, I do take it seriously, because my opinion is that gun control is only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. If you look at the demographics of the country, of the voters, the best days of the Second Amendment, I think, are behind us in terms of legislation. And I think the rest of the US is going to go the way of New York and California. So, in that way, I'm very pessimistic. But on the other hand, I think we will actually overcome that with 3D gun printing and some other things that will come out.
Mm-hmm.
So I laugh, but I also, it's a sobering thing when he says that, because it is coming.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a lot of, well, I mean, I guess it depends which kind of echo chamber you're in politically. There's a lot of, staunch supporters on the right, I guess you would say, and there's a lot of critics on the left. And, these horrific and tragic, shootings that occur in the U.S. are obviously terrible, and they point the conversation towards guns. But I mean, like when those things occur and the rhetoric that appears on the media afterwards, I'm sure we all kind of have an opinion on what gets kind of trotted out after that. What's your approach when these tragedies occur? Like, what's your opinion on them?
Well, my opinion is two things. First, I'm more interested in solving the real problem, and I'm more interested in actually reducing the violence that happens. And that means we have to solve the root problem, which is the breakdown of the family. The number one predictor of violent crime is the lack of a father in the home. This has been proven for decades across multiple studies. It's the most powerful predictor of violence. It's not the number of guns in the home, it's nothing else. That is it. The second thing is mental health. That's the second predictor of violence. So, the real cause of all this is the families and mental health issues in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my approach. I actually care. So when I hear people manipulating these tragedies for their political ends, it's quite sickening, because they're really not interested in reducing the violence. They're interested in disarming,
Hmm.
period. End of discussion. If they cared about reducing these deaths, they would talk about the importance of a father in the home. They would support measures that would give father good rights. They would support things that make marriage, more desirable. That just generally would support things that support the family, and they would also support better healthcare, better mental health initiatives. But because you don't see them talking about any of that, that tells you right there what their motives are, and that's just disarming people and getting the control of people that they don't like. And
Right.
it's really terrible because I have very personal experience with violence using guns, and also experience with people who have mental illness. So I know this very, very well, and I've worked on solving both. So I'm pretty passionate about it, and it's just too bad that people politicize it.
Right. And I'm not sure, I'm not aware of the figures, but just to extend, this tract a little bit, are you aware or familiar if, the quote unquote breakdown of the family, or the percentage of, single mothers or absentee fathers, or whatever we want to call that, is that higher in the US than other developed countries?
Well, it does break down to some ethnicities, but what we do know is that it has gotten worse over time. So when you look at the statistics, there's kind of this parallel between the breakdown of the family and violence, and it really tracks with certain groups. So I
Okay.
don't know the exact numbers, but to answer your question, um, yes, it does track with the breakdown of the family and with violence. And you can see that at the macro and micro level. You could see it at certain, I mean, if you look at the research, they, what they do is they take all these factors, age and your social economic status and all these things you could think of, your geography. And the one thing that keeps coming back is the presence of a father in the home. And if
Right.
you don't have a father in the home, the odds go way up of violent crime. If you have a strong father figure, the odds go way down. And that's across every other factor.
Hmm. And if we accept, that to be the case, and I've seen a lot of that data as well. What do you think it is? What do we attribute this current landscape, this current dynamic in which there are, in which that scenario is so prevalent? Like, what about modern society is inspiring or creating that dynamic in your mind?
Well, I think Nietzsche predicted it when he said that, God is dead, we killed him. And I can't quote Nietzsche very well, but basically he predicted that the nihilism that would result from the death of established religions would lead to this sort of thing, where life is meaningless, um, ethics are all relative. And he was right. I mean, that's what happened. Look at World War One, World War Two. So it's just modern. Let me say that again. It's just our modern. it's our modern. It's our modern age that we live in, of meaninglessness, of a lack of a family. We live in just a vapid, meaningless culture.
Yeah. And if we accept that premise, that the kind of quote unquote death of religion has left a lot of people kind of in a spiritual or metaphysical no man's land, in which, if anything kind of assumes the apex of that hierarchy, I mean, you could probably make a pretty good argument that it's the state. If it's not a higher, spiritual power, then the next highest power is your kings or your presidents or your state apparatus and that sort of thing. And I guess one of the points of religion is that um, the central figure or ideas of those religions provide an ideal that people can strive for in their lives, and then kind of bring down that ideal and try to express it and act it out in their lives. And that's there's benefit to be derived there. If it is then supplanted or replaced by something like a state apparatus, then perhaps unknowingly, subconsciously, the behavior is the same. And but it's a far different ideal, right? The ideals of the state are very different than the ideals of the core ideas of the world's religions. So, do you think that is somewhat what's at play, in that people are kind of reflecting the power apparatus of the state, and that's causing a lot of this perversion of behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. The state has become our God. There's no doubt about it. Statism is a religion. If you take a step back and say, what is religion? Well, it's ethics, it's power, it's tradition, it's authority, it's heretics, things like that. It's clear the state has replaced God. And as we know, the state is an awful thing. And so, yeah, look at the state. It's replaced the family. The state has replaced the family for, financial support, for telling you what's right and wrong, for so many things. And so we don't need to debate about, is there a God? Is there not? Is it Christianity? Is it Islam? Like, that's not what it's about. It's about having these traditions and structures and beliefs that keep families intact, that allow people to have some meaning in their life. And that's been replaced by the state, which is this horrible, meaningless monster of bureaucracy. So, yeah, absolutely. The state has a huge role to play in the breakdown of the family and mental health.
And is this, one of the things that drew you to Bitcoin originally? Because it's this kind of this phenomenon, this network that has the ability to disrupt or displace the thing that gives the state apparatus its power, i.e., the control of the issuance and direction of the money supply.
Yeah, in a way, it did. I mean, I grew up in a traditional conservative home, so we were generally anti-government, or at least small government. And then through my own kind of reading and life experiences, I really came to the realization just how awful the state is. And so between that and seeing that Bitcoin offered this great alternative to it, and then just seeing what it did for me personally on a very concrete level, then to me, Bitcoin was sort of a lifeline out of the state and the mess that a lot of things, just a lifeline out of the mess of a lot of things, I would say.
Right. Because, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, about kind of if the state has replaced that kind of, that ideal that draws people forward in their lives, or from which they borrow certain truths or ideals and try to reflect them in their lives. If the state has replaced that sort of thing, then all of its nastiness and perversion of behavior and power and corruption, etc., those are the attributes that may get expressed through people's lives. And I think we're all on the same page here with Bitcoin, in that it has a chance, and this is probably why we're all engaging in it, to take the reins of power from that apparatus. And if not dismantle it entirely, certainly provide a greater check and balance against the people that are, proposing to act on our behalf and help us structure society for the benefit of all, right?
I have sort of a strange view on Bitcoin, I think, at least compared to a lot of other people who really have strong feelings about Bitcoin. So, on one hand, I feel that Bitcoin really can arm you against the state on an individual level, but I'm very skeptical that it will otherwise eliminate it meaningfully. I think the state's going to be around for a very long time, no matter how well Bitcoin does. And with that being said, I think a lot of Bitcoiners overestimate the power of Bitcoin, broadly speaking, of what it can do to the state. I think what a lot of Bitcoiners are missing is the importance of a community. And I don't mean that in like the Twitter Bitcoin community. I mean that in a real sense, like your family, your neighbors, people that you work with, help out, eat dinner with, people like that. And just a larger sense of civilization and building a civilization. On an individual level, yes, you can opt out of certain constraints of the state, but on a general societal level, I don't really think it's going to alter the state that much. And I just don't think Bitcoin is going to have mass adoption. at least for several decades. And even if it does, the government will figure out a way to tax it anyways.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And I get what I was going to ask is how could the state apparatus maintain its size, power, and if and influence if it was financially and monetarily restrained, via something like Bitcoin? But you answered it by saying you don't think it's going to reach mass adoption for several decades. Because if it does, then it's hard to imagine that you could have these overspending, overreaching governments if they didn't have an endless piggy bank, right?
Yeah, so I look at it in terms of taxes, of course. So if the government can collect taxes, then it can pay for itself. It can exist. And so if you understand that Bitcoin is cash, it's digital cash, well, the government has been able to tax cash. So if you were paid in Bitcoin, let's say you're an attorney and your firm pays you right now, well, you automatically already get your taxes taken out for that ahead of time before you actually kind of get paid in a way, or at each paycheck. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you're paid in Bitcoin, the government would just say, hey, you need to give us your 15% income tax for this paycheck. It's in Bitcoin. Well, great. Send it to us in Bitcoin or send it to us in dollars. Either way. So most people are employees.
Right.
And so companies are going to collect their taxes. People will pay their taxes. So again, I don't think you could really, Bitcoin's going to get around that a lot with the state, but for certain individuals who are smart what they do and then maybe can move to certain jurisdictions, then yeah, sure. I think you can get away from the state at more of an individual family level.
Right. But there's two things about that, right? One is the tax revenue is only at this stage a portion of government revenue, right? They rely on borrowing and the issuance of new money, effectively new debt, to finance a lot of their activities. So at the very least, if they were restricted to only tax revenue, then you'd have to imagine that it would shrink substantially just because they have a smaller honeypot from which to draw and carry out their activities. And then the second thing is, I take your tax point, and not that I'm advocating this, but in a world where there is increasing privacy, monetary and financial privacy, there will probably be lots of ways that emerge to conceal financial transactions away from, let's say, state spying eyes, and that I can easily see a scenario in which that becomes highly sophisticated and making it even harder for a state apparatus to collect revenue in that way.
Well, of course, it's ideally that would happen, but the current reality is that 99% of people get their Bitcoin on an exchange,
Right.
Coinbase, a Cash App, a Kraken, whatever it is. And those are all, the state has their thumb on those guys. They have to collect that information and you've got to give it to them. So if Bitcoin was completely anonymous and untraceable and private, it still wouldn't matter because the exchanges and Coinbases of the world would just give the government that information anyways.
Right.
And if you say, "Oh, haha, I lost my private keys," that's fine. They'll just throw you in jail for contempt of court.
Right. Yeah. So these are some of the big issues that I think we'll see emerging over the next 10 years around Bitcoin, and whether and what I love about this community is that it is a solutions-based community. So as a problem emerges, as an attack vector emerges, I do think a lot, as this community grows, a lot of motivated people are going to try to build solutions. But of course, it's going to be a tug of war, back and forth, because this is, the state is the biggest power apparatus that there is, and they are not going to relinquish easily without a fight their main source of their power. So it's going to be, it's not always going to be fun and games in this this revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that Bitcoiners again miss, and I kind of mentioned this before, but not in detail, is you actually can get away from the state a little bit, and you don't even need money to do it. Kind of one example is the Muslim communities in Europe, especially in the UK, where you have entire neighborhoods of Muslims, and they have their own society. They pretty much have their own courts, even their own police to a certain extent. Obviously, they have their own, economy and restaurants and everything else. but they're kind of left alone. Um, and they're able to do that because they're so united and they're so intolerant of everything else. And they're so forceful with it that they actually are semi sovereign. And I don't think Bitcoin powers their economy at all. Whereas these libertarians floating around where every man is an island thinking he's going to go up against the state with his Bitcoin. I mean, it sounds like a great story. But I think that would be kind of the exception to the rule. So I guess my point is that, yeah, Bitcoin can definitely help that. I mean, it's already helped a lot of us now. But if we really want to get serious about that goal, we should look at, the Muslim communities, the Christian anarchist communities in the United States in the 18th and 17th centuries. They were able to be semi self-sovereign within the United States.
And so do you see the kind of the people that come at this from a libertarian point of view? Has your experience in interacting with them and observing them been that, they shun community?
Yeah, because as you know, the libertarian philosophy is very individualistic, and that's the starting point. And I think that's great for the law. You have to treat people as individuals under the law, and rights come at the level of the individual. So that's the correct starting point, but that's just the first step. In reality, if you look at history, when individuals really thrive and survive, it's when they're in a tribe or a community that is strong, united, and intolerant of outsiders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my personal opinion on this is I believe that we should all be, to the extent possible, as independent and self-sovereign as possible. But then I think after doing that, or in tandem with doing that, is creating a community of like-minded people, engaging in a community of like-minded people. But I think the strength of that community is based on, or at least partially based on, the degree to which no member is vulnerable or dependent on it. So it's a community of sovereign individuals interacting by choice, but not because I haven't. I think being dependent on anything is an issue, and that's not to say that we shouldn't engage in relationships, of or shouldn't benefit from certain relationships or communities, etc. But just that we should do so as on a as free basis as possible, so that should the dynamic change, shouldn't that we would be okay should something change in that dynamic, because we are not wholly dependent on it.
Yeah, so dependence is a tricky thing because you're always dependent on something. I mean, just for me to use my cell phone, I'm dependent on my cell phone carrier. So yeah, looking at what you depend on is important, and that's why you got to build interdependence on the right people. And talking about the Bitcoin community, which we say community because we don't quite have the right word. I mean, we know there's no true community because it's crypto anarchy. But if we take that concept, Bitcoin community, whatever that means, the people you follow on Twitter, the people you talk to at conferences, the people you interview on podcasts, if you look at it that way, if you look at your local Bitcoin meetup group, so if we say that's the Bitcoin community, I would say that's extremely weak. The Bitcoin community is extremely weak compared to other communities. For example, Muslim communities in Europe, or just Muslim communities in their home countries. If you look at religious communities here in the US, they're much stronger than Bitcoin communities. I mean, look at perfect example. Okay, guns and Bitcoin. We sell hats and our scorpion case and sticker packs and things. Well, 95% of Bitcoiners don't pay with Bitcoin. Now, we understand why, because everyone wants to keep their Bitcoin, but we're trying to create a circular economy for our community, and we can't even do that. And I'm guilty. Hey, when I buy stuff, it's rare that I pay in Bitcoin, and I am a hypocrite for that. But it's like if we're going to power this community and we're not even using Bitcoin to power the Bitcoin community, I don't know. It's not
But
really community.
do you think it's a timing issue? Like, could it be the case that we're all biding our time. We're all, strengthening our positions so that when the time comes to be more out there, to be more interactive with quote unquote community members, to actually, you know, to to launch, let's say, this circular economy. Could it be a timing thing? It's just not right now. Nobody feels that it's the right time, but in 10, 20 years, perhaps it will be.
Yeah, that's tricky. It's sort of a chicken and an egg problem. So no one wants to start using their Bitcoin to pay for everything. Yet at the same time, we know we probably should try to do that more often. So it's like, okay, once everyone's gonna, use their Bitcoin, I will as well. So that's the issue is it has to start, but no one wants to start it. I don't know if that's game
Does it
theory or not, but
does it have to start though? Does it have to be, does it have to start being used as a means of payment, means of exchange?
yeah, it absolutely does because we were talking about the state, right? And so, okay, how do you get away from the state? How do you live in such a way that they, can't touch your Bitcoin or can't track what you're doing or can't collect taxes? Well, in that scenario, the way that would have to happen would be all your transactions are done with Bitcoin because if they're done with dollars, obviously the bank can seize them, PayPal can cut you off, all these things. And so in theory, if everything is done in Bitcoin, they don't know what's moving who from who and to where, and they have a tough time seizing it because your private keys protect it. So yeah, I think truly the only way that Bitcoin can create self-sovereign individuals is if you're Bitcoin 100%. Now I
Mhm.
know there's guys who are, but they're a tiny fraction.
Is it possible that many of us are just waiting for the various state monies to fail? So for just kind of accumulating what we would consider a better money, a harder money, sounder money, et cetera, all the attributes that we know. Um, but we will continue to use state money in place of that until such time that the state money fails under the weight of its own abuses.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's what a lot of people are thinking, and that's sort of the hyper Bitcoinization idea that once that happens, then we'll just all switch over. But I'm not so sure that's really ever going to happen. And even if it does, I don't think it'll change that much. I mean, look, at people can do it right now, right? Like people could buy guns and Bitcoin stuff with their Bitcoin, and I can pay people in Bitcoin, that I earned, and it's like, okay, ISP or a cell phone provider, I can pay in Bitcoin, but it just doesn't happen. And the other thing is, I don't think when people say, "Oh, fiat is going to collapse," well, I mean, yes, but no. I mean, look at Venezuela. But look at the rest of North and South America. Like Venezuela collapsed, but that's kind of a localized thing. And these collapses are kind of temporary. Like the worst thing in a way was, the Russian when the Russian when was this? When they defaulted on their debts. That's obviously terrible, but it bounced back. And
Hmm.
the financial crisis, yeah, they got bailed out, but these fiat crises, they're terrible, but they don't last for 10 years. Like they come back. Um, I mean, they're going to happen, but I don't think they are so bad that, oh, we have this financial crisis and Bitcoin ushers in and spreads like the tide. Like, I don't see that happen. Like,
Do you
I
think?
don't think there's precedent for that.
Which I agree. I don't think there is precedent, but I think that may be the argument. I think maybe that is one of the, uh, that's what makes this special. In that, in previous times when the state money has failed, there's been no alternative, and as a result, when everything got put back together again, people had no choice but to just accept what the new version, as it were.
Yeah.
Whereas I guess we're all wondering and hoping that this time there is an alternative available, and it's an alternative that's fairly difficult to stop. Certainly, there are measures of control that can be enacted, but fairly difficult to stop. And I think what we're all hoping, and look, we everyone in Bitcoin kind of glorifies the failure of fiat money and the state, and I'm not in that camp as much as I'm fully aware of the negative consequences of the state controlling the money supply and monetary policy and all of that, the simple fact that it's so ingrained in so many different aspects of society and life today, that a collapse of that nature would be just so incredibly disruptive on, personally, societally, community. Like I'm really not. I really hope it doesn't happen in that way. Like what I'm hoping for is a slowly but surely transition, and this is what I said a few minutes ago. I think all Bitcoiners are just kind of getting prepared for a transition so that when the time comes, that transition can be smoother, because, collapses are, as we know, you look at history, incredibly, tumultuous events, and they lead to a lot of follow-on things that nobody wants. And so I don't want to glorify the collapse, but it's hard not to look at things objectively and see the writing on the wall. And as you're saying, one scenario is everything goes to hell, but the state stays in control and they relaunch something and they say it's going to be different this time and people actually buy it. Or maybe Bitcoin and will be at a space then, or just the fact that it even exists will make that harder to pass off. In previous generations and times when private banks or state banks or that sort of thing failed, then when they said, listen, new government, trust us this time, it's all going to work out, we'll back it by gold for a period of time, hint hint, or whatever, and the people had no choice. Well, okay, what are we going to do? We're not going to go back to barter. But maybe this time it will be different, because there will be at least an imperfect, if imperfect, alternative available for people to engage in, should that happen. And maybe that will change the dynamic of how things reemerge after that.
Yeah. So basically, Bitcoin is insurance against that. So I agree with that thesis that when things go bad, that Bitcoin could be sort of, a lifeline that will stand up against other things. I think in a crisis, everything goes down.
Right.
But Bitcoin might go down a lot less. But maybe more importantly, I think your Bitcoin can't be seized in the way that your savings account can. To me, that's when I think of a financial crisis in Bitcoin, that's what I think of. Seizing people's wealth, emptying out their bank accounts.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is what Bitcoin is about. Like if you look at Argentina and Venezuela, it's like, okay, both of those had several fiat crises, right? But what happened with Bitcoin there? Well, for certain people, it really helped them. But they were the minority. So I think that's what happens in a crisis. Some people who have Bitcoin benefit. There's a huge arbitrage. Their Bitcoin can't be seized like their credit cards and their bank accounts can. That's what it is. Not so much like, oh, now the economy runs on Bitcoin.
Right. Right. And so do you think, you recently launched a podcast. Bravo, by the way. Congratulations. I listened to a few episodes in preparation for this. Do you think it's important then to really kind of double down on education and awareness about this thing? Because like you said, Argentina, Venezuela, Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, like all these places where, had there been a greater familiarity, a greater awareness with something like Bitcoin, perhaps it would have helped out more people. Now, the flip side of that is a lot of people are going to probably raise an eyebrow about, taking their cash from one system that's going to devalue it or confiscate it and put it into something that seemingly is equally volatile because of the way Bitcoin moves. But of course, if you zoom out a bit and look at things longer term, then, even if you're not looking at it from an investment perspective, it certainly does. It certainly looks like a safer bet than having someone confiscate it and you not being able to access it. But do you think education is really what's maybe lacking, or what needs to be more of in this sort of space?
I think education is, of course, important. And I don't think we lack education, really. I think we're just not focusing on being more practical. And to me, I would say the biggest weakness right now is how people buy Bitcoin, which is from exchanges.
Mm-hmm.
To me, if we could solve that, I mean, we solve so much. And fortunately, you have people working on it that are smart. The Samurai wallet Wasabi's making an attempt, and then obviously at the protocol level. So there's very smart people working hard on the software part of that. And so instead of reading books about Bitcoin and going to conferences and this and that, which are all great, we just need to start our local Bitcoin meetup groups and attend them and do everything we can to support them. And when we go there, try to buy and sell $20 worth of Bitcoin to start forming relationships with people that you can do that. To me, that's what we need, is not necessarily more education, but like every single city needs to have a Bitcoin meetup group where people buy and sell Bitcoin from each other, even if it's $5, $10, and then just let that grow. To me, that's what's really lacking. I think it's lacking so bad, and it's such a gaping hole in Bitcoin that hopefully that will change. And we're starting to see that. Like, my local Bitcoin meetup group is awesome. It just started a few months ago, but they've already put on some great events. They have some ones planned in the future. They're already planning to do that, like getting together before the next one an hour early and just, hey, anyone who wants to buy and sell some Bitcoin. And it's more of a fun thing. It's not like big amounts. It's just to kind of do it.
Right.
And then I saw at the Baltic Honey Badger, I think they set some time apart to do that. So hopefully this will start a trend. And that's what Bitcoin really needs right now, is just people and meet space that you can buy and sell Bitcoin from, or then, meet digitally. Like maybe, you and I are on this podcast, and maybe one day I'll email you and say, hey, I need $100 worth of Bitcoin, something like that. So really making, when we talk about Bitcoin being peer to peer, like it's not just like your node, like it's also who you buy and sell Bitcoin from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think it's good or bad to have community members, podcasters, people that are producing content in various forms, kind of promoting or proselytizing for Bitcoin? Do you think it needs that? Do you think that's helpful, or do you think it's, or a hindrance? What do you feel about people kind of actively attempting to foster adoption more quickly?
I think it's fine, but the more people talk about one thing, the less they have to talk about another thing. So if, let's say there's a conference, like a 2-day conference,
Mm-hmm.
and 90% of the time is spent talking about different things, but not getting people to trade Bitcoin with each other and not teaching people how to have good privacy practices, then that 90% probably shouldn't have been done. I mean, from my point of view, now maybe a lot of people don't agree with me, but to me, that's the big gaping hole in Bitcoin, is that everyone buys Bitcoin on exchanges.
Yeah.
And so, yes, these teaching, education, and proselytizing is good in theory, but the fact is most of that education and talking is taking the room and the space and energy away from what should actually be doing, which is what I said, which was buying and selling Bitcoin peer to peer with people that you know.
Yeah. So kind of, really strengthening and disseminating best practices for the basics, and not getting, because I think all of us in the Bitcoin space, I tweeted about this a few days ago, and that we're all terrified of information asymmetry. And what I meant by that is there's so much happening in the space so fast. The tech is evolving. There's products and services coming up all the time. And we all feel such an obligation to be familiar, aware, educated on them. We don't want to seem like idiots. We want to, we want to fully engage with this technology and this phenomenon. But as you said, perhaps at conferences and podcasts and things like that, what gets lost, we're all so much at the tip of the spear on this thing, at the forefront of the tech, when, perhaps 99% of people really, that's at this point irrelevant, and it may always be. It might be one of those things that runs in the background and people never even are aware of. But the privacy and the ability to have this insurance mechanism, as you mentioned, to acquire some and do so on a secure and private basis is perhaps the most important part, and maybe there should be more focus put toward that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, with Guns and Bitcoin, we're trying to, build a community. And by that, we just mean trying to bring people together in meet space or in some other way to actually interact as humans. And that could mean many things, but I come from things from a very paranoid point of view. I come from like what's the worst thing that can happen, because I've had some bad things happen and I've seen, the result of that. And so with guns and Bitcoin, it's about what's the worst thing that could happen and preparing for that. And that involves guns and that involves Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
So a good question to ask people is, when was the last time you were in a hurricane or an earthquake or a tornado or a tsunami or something, or a war where there wasn't electricity, there wasn't water, or you couldn't go out of your house, or whatever it might be? And okay, describe that. What was that like? How did you get food? How did you use money? Where did you get the money from? Like all these things. And when you go through that exercise, then you realize, oh shoot, I need to kind of like do some things. I got to put some cash in the side. I got to stock up on some food and water. Like I need to be on better terms with my brother-in-law because, he's got all the first aid supplies. Like that's what I mean by community. If Bitcoiners are saying, we're going to wait for this financial collapse and that's when Bitcoin's really going to take off, it's my insurance policy. Well, those worst case scenarios are really, really bad. And if those things happen, like I don't think Coinbase is going to be accessible.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
even if it is, you can't access it. So to me, I'm a very like paranoid person, and when I think of Bitcoin, I think of how does that help me when the state cracks down on it, when there's a hurricane or worst case scenario? Because kind of otherwise, fiat works fine, PayPal works fine.
Right. Yeah, and perhaps I'll take this opportunity to swerve back to the gun issue. But I agree, and I tend to look at these things in terms of history and probability, and the interplay. The way in which history can inform your assessment of probability, and I think that's lost on a lot. The status quo is such a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's such a coddling sort of thing. It causes you to forget the things of the past so easily. And you brought up food. I mentioned this on a previous podcast, so I won't go into too much detail. But basically, I'm from an island in the North Atlantic called Newfoundland, right? So this in wintertime, there's often winter storms and stuff that cut off the ships from coming in for several days at a time. This happens at least once a winter, it seems. The grocery store shelves go empty. Most people have stuff in their freezer and their fridge, and people stock up before the storm comes. So it's not that big of an impact. But that's something that happens normally. If there's ever something greater, oil shock, war, bigger storm, stuff like that, the island produces almost no food. So the 500,000 people that live there would be totally screwed. And so I took it upon myself just to assess that risk and say, I think it's a worthwhile investment to put some money towards some dried food. Cost $2,000, lasts for 25 years. I'm okay with that expense over that time period. And the probability of needing it over the 25 years, it's not zero. Maybe it's low, but in my mind, it wasn't zero. And for the peace of mind, I was willing to make that investment. And I think that a lot of people are failing to see the world through that lens. And the reason why I say let's swerve back to the gun argument is because around the rhetoric on the side of the people that are anti-gun today is and I had this discussion with someone on Twitter. It's ongoing actually, but it was basically like I think it's best to have for the state to have a defensive army to protect their citizenry and their country and their sovereignty, etc. But I don't believe citizens should have access to firearms. And my response was, well, sure, that in an ideal scenario, that would be great. But what happens if that state power apparatus falls into the wrong hands and gets directed towards you instead of towards an invading army? And there's never a good answer to that question. There just isn't. And I think gun supporters would say, sorry, the answer. Let me rephrase that. The answer is, well, what are we going to do against tanks and nukes? And my response was, yeah, fair point. But at least millions of people having the ability to resist in some capacity provides a check or balance or puts up a fight should that scenario occur. And looking back through the 20th century, that scenario has occurred enough times that people should at least be they should be aware that it's occurred enough times that it should cause them to consider how they might respond.
Yeah, I agree. And what you said was something about, I think, statistics or probability, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly the case. Like, what if you have, what worries you more, a 50% chance of breaking your arm and leg or a 1% chance of getting struck by lightning and dying? To me, it's that 1% chance of lightning striking me. And so with what you said about the state and guns is absolutely correct, that maybe in the recent past that hasn't happened. Like if you lived in, say, Norway, which is a generally pretty benign country, pretty benign government, for them, maybe it's less likely. But if it does happen, then what? You're at zero. So for me, guns and Bitcoin are, if nothing else, insurance against something terrible happening.
Yeah.
At best, it's a great tool that is fun and makes you rich. But at the base, at the base level, it's insurance.
Right.
It's insurance. And so, like you said, why not have some? Whether it's Bitcoin or whether it's guns, why not
Right.
just have some, just in case? And if you're wrong, what's the worst thing that happens?
Right. It's just I just find it's an incredibly vulnerable. We were talking about in terms of community and being dependent on things and stuff like that. I just find it's an incredibly vulnerable and dependent position to be in by basically just saying, I hope things go well, because if they don't, I have no recourse. Like, just at some point, someone is going to take advantage of that attitude. And again, that's been the case throughout history. But we're going to break into the rapid fire portion now in a sec, but I've never actually talked about my stance on guns in the show, and I guess you're the best person to do it with. But I actually grew up on the other side. I thought, why are assault weapons, quote unquote, assault weapons? I know there's a lot of misconceptions about the definition. Why are they allowed to be owned by people? Clearly, this is contributing to a lot of these massacres that we've seen. Guns scare me. Basically, I thought, yeah, it's probably a good thing that people don't have them. I mean, that was where I was coming from, and so I've had to wonder why this shift has occurred in me, because I was always skeptical of the state, and I was always that kind of, I was a bit of a conspiracy nut when I was a teenager, and always talking about money and gold and this kind of stuff. But now, I've kind of transformed over the last, let's say, 10 years. Guns still frighten me, to be honest. I haven't had enough experience with them. I've fired a couple of handguns, a couple of rifles, but they're tools of extreme power, and it's life or death in your hands. And I haven't spent enough time with them to be really comfortable with that feeling. But I do recognize that, again, looking at probabilities and looking at history, that much as they may enable the expression of negative behavior, of behavior in society that we would deem negative, i.e., yes, some of these, shootings will occur if people have guns. But one, as you said earlier, what's the real cause of why people decide to kill, 20 people in their school? The gun didn't cause them to want to do that. And so we should be looking at the things in society that are causing that sort of behavior to bubble up. And two, back to the argument we've just been discussing, it seems like it's a too vulnerable a position to just cross your fingers and hope things go well. So I think, as you mentioned, growing up with a father figure, grandfather figure, strong mother, strong grandmother, whatever it is, that's able to kind of instill in you the great responsibility and maturity that's required to wield a tool of such power, and understand why it's important to be able to have the ability to defend and protect yourself and your family and your community.
Yeah, having that father figure to teach you that is important. But just, having a father means you're not fucked up. When you don't have a
Right.
father, you are fucked up. And that leads to all sorts of problems that some legislation is never going to solve.
Yeah. I do think, in society today, I like to look at traditional. I mean, I love history, and lots of traditional societies had rites of passage for young boys, and in cases, young girls as well, usually in different capacities. But whether it's 13, 16, 12, whenever it occurred, but it was kind of this process of making young people realize the responsibility that they would have to bear in emerging into the real world as an adult, and all the different things that entailed. And these rites of passage would kind of like inform them, like, okay, now's the time, and these are the lessons that you need to try to integrate. And I feel like, I think having a father figure is kind of that, because it it gives you an example to try to pursue. And obviously there's lots of wisdom transferred both directly and indirectly. But I think in society today we've lost that. And if anything, we're people are kept in a juvenile people are treated in such a juvenile manner, like far into their adulthood. I mean, that's one of the issues with media today, is that everyone is treated like such a goddamn child. And as a result, we have a society that's full of immature behavior.
Yeah, you could do a whole episode on the topic of fatherhood and families and just being a male in today's society, and how it's gotten so messed up. I mean,
Yeah.
that could be a whole podcast series. I think absolutely.
Well, you should work on it on yours. All right, Ragnar. I mean, I'm really enjoying this discussion, but I want to be respectful of your time. The last thing I wanted to break into, though, because it is such a disruptive idea, concept, and phenomenon that's happening simultaneously, is the 3D printing thing, right? Because again, in the past, we were talking about how kind of government would, if they confiscated your guns, then you're kind of shit out of luck, right? Same with money. If they just said, well, we're going to start over with a new money, you had to kind of accept it. Now, because of this technology, the power to create defensive tools, guns, in individually is now here. People can basically 3D print guns, and as we move forward over the next decade, obviously it's going to become easier and easier. I mean, what does that mean to you, and how do you think it's changing this dynamic of state power, gun ownership, the gun debate, all of that? Like, what is it? What's your take on it?
Well, with 3D printed guns, I see a parallel with Bitcoin, which is it's a way to get around certain things that the state does. So, and they're both legal. So, this is what's interesting. Like, Bitcoin is legal, but it lets you get around these financial restrictions. And 3D printed guns are legal, and they let you get around these restrictions of needing a background check. So, for those who don't know, in the US, when you go to buy a gun, they do a quick background check on you. And the guns that you buy are registered. There's a registration number on each gun, and that's connected to your name. And that's how they know what guns you have, and that's how they prevent people from buying guns. With 3D printed guns, it's legal to make your own gun at home. You can't sell it unless you're a firearms dealer, but you can make your own gun for yourself. And in at least, I think, 48 states, you then don't need to put a serial number on that gun. You can just make it, no serial number, and you don't need to report it. I think California and maybe one or two other states, that's different. But the point is that 3D printing technology is going around these restrictions that say when you buy a gun, it has to be serialized, because you're not buying a gun at all, right? Whereas Bitcoin, it's like there is no bank. So we don't need to talk about banking rules, because there is no bank. Bitcoin is your bank. So I see a major parallel between 3D printed guns and Bitcoin. It's a self-defensive measure. It's a way that technology has got around the state in certain ways while still being in this legal area that is actually a nice area to be in. And it's still the early days with 3D printed guns. We're going to do a lot of podcasts on 3D printed guns at Guns and Bitcoin, but it's definitely going to obsolete certain regulations through technology.
Right. And one of the arguments that I think has been invoked for, can't remember that you probably know the name of the company, Decentral something. Yes,
Defense distributed. Yeah.
yes. I think that one of the arguments that they tried to invoke, I'm not too familiar with the case, but was that they shouldn't be subject to punishment of any kind because they, or maybe they shifted to this, but basically code is speech, right? And if you as a result, are there protections for free speech? Are the protections for free speech the same? Should they be applied to code? Because code is a form of language, and if you're just disseminating code, you're just speaking freely, and whatever anybody does with that is none of your business.
Yeah, that's the argument that code is speech. And this isn't anything new, of course. I mean, back when we were dealing with encryption, Adam Back actually, Adam Back of Blockstream and Hashcash, he printed, code on a T-shirt, and which was supposed to be like, this is munitions, but here he goes and he prints it on a T-shirt. Are you going to take my T-shirt away? Of course not. So yeah, code is speech, and that's a question of Bitcoin as well. And
Yeah.
it's a question with 3D printed guns. You're right. That is the argument that Defense Distributed made was, well, wait, this is just speech. And the State Department was saying, no, this is under the Munitions Act. In other words, it's a weapon. Like the State Department controls weapons. You can't just come up with a plan for a nuclear bomb and then just publish it. That's a munition. And so that's what they were trying to say with the 3D printed gun files. They were saying it's a weapon. And the argument actually went out was, no, this is speech. It's not a munition. So that's the big debate with 3D printed guns. Is it speech? And if so, is it protected?
Yeah, and like you said, the same with Bitcoin, right? Because if a ban ever comes down or regulations or what have you, it's like, well, at core, is it not just language? Is it not just code? Is it not just speech? And should it be treated differently?
Yeah. And in a way, you have to be prepared for them saying it's not speech or it is speech, but it's not protected. And if they do that, well, what are you going to do about it? So it's like, if you have your Bitcoin, did you secure it in the best way that you can? Are you familiar with 3D printed guns? Do you know how it works? Do you know where you could learn about it? Have you made some yourself? Like, you kind of just have to be prepared for, again, being paranoid.
Yeah.
You have to be prepared for the worst case scenario.
And I think this issue is going to keep popping up because, in my opinion, and I think probably in the opinion of many others, is that we are moving ever further into a digital age, a digital reality. Now, whether that culminates in us existing, plugging into the matrix and being there full time, or spending part of our time there, but the kind of the window into the digital, from the TV to the computer to the cell phone to the contact lens, is creeping ever closer, and we're spending ever more time in there. And as a result, all of these things that used to be manifestations of the physical world, guns and money and etc., are now going to be converted into replicas or manifestations in the digital world. And in the digital world, everything is code, everything is language, everything is speech. So how will regulation adjust to not just guns and money, but we're gonna be confronting this issue on everything, because as a more complete reality begins to emerge in the digital form and we continue to engage in it more, we're going to keep bumping up against this issue.
Yeah, it's all about speech. And what we say at Guns and Bitcoin is that we're in a cyberpunk dystopia. And that's what it is, where you have the convergence of the physical and the digital worlds. So guns, is it physical? Yeah, it's rifles and triggers that are metal and plastic, but it's also digital now with 3D gun printing. What about Bitcoin? Is that physical? Well, sure, money's physical. You buy stuff with it, but it's actually just, code. And so that's this dystopia that we're moving towards: physical and digital becoming one, massive surveillance, corporations merging with the state, or they're kind of indistinguishable. So all the things we've talked about are defenses, asymmetric defenses against all that, whether it's guns or Bitcoin.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, so first one is, what is money?
Money is what you use to get paid and to pay people and to store your work.
If you had to explain Bitcoin to your grandmother or someone over 80, what would you say?
I would say that Bitcoin is the best money that's ever been invented, and I'll handle everything for you.
What is the primary reason why Bitcoin is important or interesting to you?
The primary reason why Bitcoin is important and interesting to me is that it's insurance against a worst case scenario, and it's an asymmetric defense against the state. It's seizure resistant, and it's censorship resistant. And I've been subjected to all of those, and Bitcoin has helped me, and I think it will in the future.
What does the sovereign individual, quote unquote, sovereign individual, mean to you?
The sovereign individual is an overrated concept that people can be completely self reliant and not be bound or controlled by the state, when in fact, you need to be sovereign in along with a community of people who could actually back that up.
How long after you first heard of Bitcoin did you start learning more about it and purchase it?
Once I learned about Bitcoin from Reddit on the anarcho capitalism subreddit, it was pretty much an obsession nonstop. It was full on immediately.
What has been your most effective method of educating people about Bitcoin in conversation or more formally?
I think just doing a transaction between phones and then giving them a scenario of, let's think about what happens, some terrible event, and you need money fast and you're on the other side of the world. Here's what you can do.
What movie or song is most related to Bitcoin in your opinion?
Blade Runner.
Can Bitcoin be stopped? If so, what is Bitcoin's biggest vulnerability? If not, why not?
Bitcoin can absolutely be stopped. There's several ways that it can be stopped. It could obviously implode on its own with a code bug. But I think the main way that Bitcoin can be stopped, the most likely way that Bitcoin will be stopped, is by us doing what we're currently doing, which is not getting our Bitcoin from sources that aren't KYC and AML. So if Bitcoin ever gets stopped, it will be because the government has its fingers on the exchanges.
What was your most recent aha or level up in your understanding of Bitcoin?
When I installed BTC Pay Server and started using BTC Pay Server for guns and Bitcoin, it's really amazing. I usually don't get too excited about things that aren't like Bitcoin itself, but BTC Pay Server is very amazing, and learned a lot, and got I definitely am at a new level now with running BTC Pay Server.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that one, there's been a lot of attention around BTC Pay Server over the last few months, but in particular, this past week, Square Crypto, which is Square, Jack Dorsey's sort of what would you call it, a Bitcoin charity. They're basically funding enterprises in the Bitcoin space. Gave 100,000 US to BTC Pay Server to aid with their development. But I just wanted to ask you real quickly: why is it that is such a interesting, important, service or product for you?
Because BTC Pay Server is the front end of Bitcoin. If we want to have a Bitcoin economy, you need a way to accept Bitcoin. You need a way to invoice people. You need a way to crowdfund people. You need a wallet for that. You need to run a full node connected to that. You need to be able to do Lightning payments. I mean, now that I've been using BTC Pay Server, it's it's very hard to do Bitcoin commerce without BTC Pay Server. And so as Bitcoin matures as a currency, its BTC Pay Server will be more and more important, because ultimately, if this is about money, you need a way to collect it, store it, send it, and record it. And that's what BTC Pay Server does. It adds so much functionality to Bitcoin, the currency.
What do you think will be Bitcoin's biggest impact on society?
Um, I don't really care. I think what matters is Bitcoin's impact on people and individuals.
When, if ever, do you think the first central bank will start adding Bitcoin to their reserves? And will central banks exist in 20 years?
Central banks will definitely still exist in 20 years and probably long after that. I think the first central bank that will add Bitcoin to their reserves will be a small island nation, Bahamas, Bermuda, something like that.
What is the biggest mistake you've made with Bitcoin?
Losing the private keys to my first Bitcoin. I protected my wallet file with a password that I forgot.
How do you feel about Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin's creator, being anonymous and the coins that he likely controls?
I think it's amazing that he's remained anonymous so far, at least to the citizens, although I'm pretty sure that the state knows who Satoshi is, the NSA and DHS know who Satoshi is. And either way, that anonymous nature of Satoshi is one thing that has made Bitcoin be so strong. And I don't think Bitcoin could really exist in its form if he wasn't anonymous.
What have you learned about yourself, or how have you changed, if at all, as a result of learning about and interacting with Bitcoin?
Bitcoin has got me into things that I never cared about, like economics and technology and cryptography and sound money, uh, open source software. Basically, everything that Bitcoin's about, I never had really any interest in until Bitcoin.
At what price would you permanently sell over 75% of your Bitcoin, assuming there is no necessity to do so?
When it would benefit my family the most.
Have you ever purchased other coins? If so, are you likely to do so again in the future?
I have never bought any other cryptocurrencies besides Bitcoin. Someone gave me Ether once years ago, and I sent it to a dead address because of the way Ethereum addresses are set up. That's my only ownership of anything other than Bitcoin.
What is your most controversial or contrarian view or opinion? If none on Bitcoin, any subject is okay.
I think that would be my opinion on how bad things are with buying Bitcoin on all the exchanges. I don't see a lot of people talking about that.
Ballpark estimate of Bitcoin's price in 5 years.
200,000.
Do you believe there are any reliable ways at spotting a paradigm shift? If so, what are they?
You could spot a paradigm shift when people you used to think were crazy now don't sound crazy.
I like that. Do you have a morning routine? If so, what is it?
Yes, to go very slow.
Can you elaborate?
I wake up slow, drink coffee slow, read emails slow, I walk slow, eat slow. I just don't do anything fast. Every morning for me is different, but what's always the same is I take it very slowly.
And what's the purpose of that?
No purpose. It's just how I'm hardwired, I guess.
Okay. How do you define success?
Not being worried.
Where or who is your go-to place to learn more about Bitcoin?
Twitter.
What is the one most important action that I or anyone listening can take to up our game in your area of expertise? So if we want to improve, what's the best way you know how to do that at this point in time?
Take a gun training course and run a full note if you're not already.
What is one question you'd like to see added to this list?
What's the worst thing that's ever happened to you that you can share publicly?
Ooh, that's intense. Okay, so final part. These are word associations. So I'll say a word and you just tell me the first thing that pops into your mind. Satoshi Nakamoto.
Anonymous.
Government.
Bad.
Hash rate.
High.
The individual.
Overrated.
Security.
Elusive.
Ego.
The enemy.
Greed.
Ubiquitous.
Stacking sats.
Lame, but useful.
Fiat currency.
Meh, who cares?
Guns.
Bitcoin.
Guns and Bitcoin.
Awesome.
Altcoins.
Scam.
Pizza.
Overrated.
How dare you? Socialism.
Poison.
Family.
What matters most?
Trump.
Hilarious.
Future.
Bright.
Libra.
Hilarious.
Gold.
Boring.
And Bitcoin.
The best.
Ragnar, that's all I got for you, man. That was thoroughly enjoyable. I'm sure we could speak for a lot longer. Maybe someday, if we're face to face, we'll do that. Is there anything you wanted to mention that we didn't cover, and or throw out some destinations?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. It was fun talking to you. We could definitely go on. Maybe we will if we're in the same geographical location. But no, just if you include my website, that's about it. All I need, and I think we covered a lot of ground, though.
Sure. So yeah, no, I like I said, this is something that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. Most people aren't as equipped as you or as engaged in this subject matter to actually have that discussion. So yeah, and obviously it's a big discussion happening both in the quote unquote Bitcoin community and the broader community today. So thank you very much for coming on and being open and having that discussion with me. So your website is guns and
Yeah,
bitcoin.com.
yeah. Guns, the letter N, Bitcoin, just like Guns and Roses. It's gunsandbitcoin.com.
Right. And then on Twitter, what are the two handles
Same
for you
thing.
and them? So guns and Bitcoin.
Yes. Yeah. So at Guns and Bitcoin, and then for me, it's Ragnarly, Ragnarly.
Sweet. All right, man. Well, look, again, really appreciate it. Really enjoyed it. And hopefully, whether it's in person or maybe in 6 to 12 months when, time passes so fast in this space, I'm sure you guys will be in a much different spot and probably me as well. So it'll be fun to catch up in the future sometime and just, keep talking about some of these interesting concepts.
Yeah, and thanks for talking about guns. I know it's a kind of a controversial topic, but now that with guns and Bitcoin, more and more people are kind of coming out of the woodwork and sharing, their diverse thoughts. So it's been a good thing. I like to see this because in Bitcoin, there's a lot of smart people, I think, and just like really good people. So it's nice when people that we have things in common with, think similarly. I know with guns, you have similar views. Probably some things are different, but we both, I think, are on the same page with most of things. So it's nice to hear. So thanks for taking the risk of talking about it, I guess.
Well, man, I think I'm excited for your podcast because I do think that this is a subject for those reasons that just it needs a lot more sensible, rational, logical dialogue because so much of the rhetoric is sensational, and it's easy to understand why because there's a lot of things, a lot of fucked up things that happen in the world. But I just think on this issue in particular, the more voices that are coming at it with logic and reason, and taking the emotion out of it, the better. So if you're going to be doing that, or you are going to be doing that with the podcast, so I wish you well in that, and yeah, in all future endeavors as well. So we'll talk again in the future.
Thanks. I appreciate it, and I'll look forward to the podcast coming out. I'll definitely share it around.
Awesome. All right, brother. Take care of
All right.
yourself.
All right. Thanks, John.
Cheers. Bye-bye.